Buying a new bow can be very exciting. You pick the style and model that you like, give the bowyer a deposit, and sit back and wait for him to work his magic. Hi, I'm Mike Phillips, and this is Mike Stevens, and what we're going to try to show you in this video is that it's not magic at all. With some basic woodworking skills and general information about building a bow, you should be able to build your own a laminated longbow that is suitable for hunting big game, target shooting, or just general fun shooting. And there's nothing more satisfying than watching an arrow fly from a bow that you built yourself, and it's definitely within the reach of anyone that's willing to try. Now, there's a few things you should consider before you start your project, and we're going to go over a couple of those right now.
One of the things you're going to need to decide is, how many bows do I want to build? There are some inherent costs in building one bow, the same as building 2 or 3 bows. The cost of your oven, building your form, your finishing products. You may want to get 2 or 3 buddies involved that have the same interest and would like to build a bow. This is going to help you in a couple ways. First of all, it's going to split the cost. 2 or 3 people can use the same form and the same oven. You're also, by having 2 or 3 people involved, building this bow, you're going to have some extra set of hands and some extra eyes, besides splitting the cost. It's nice to do something like this with 2 or 3 people. You also want to consider weight.
Yeah. First thing that happens usually when somebody decides to build a bow or even buy a bow, they get overbowed. And that means a bow that the draw weight is too heavy for them to shoot comfortably. A lot of guys think if they shoot a 70-pound compound that they can shoot a 70-pound longbow, and it's just not so. Don't be fooled or drawn in by the macho claims and brags by some guys. You do not need a 70-pound bow to hunt with. A 55 or 60-pound longbow will harvest almost any big game animal in America, and it's much more pleasant to shoot. It won't lead to bad habits that are hard to correct later on down the road. You do want to have fun. That's why we're in this in the first place, and the best way to do that is to shoot a bow that you're comfortable with. One more thing you might want to consider is the tools that are required to build these bows. Will you have access to some of the tools that we're going to be using? Check around with your friends, check some hobby shops. Some schools will let you use their wood hobby shops. A lot of it can be done with simple hand tools. The majority of it can be filed or sanded, and there's just some basic power tools that you'll need during the process, and you should be able to find those and use them. We'll try to give you some alternatives as we go along, and you'll find that it's very minimal, the number of power tools that you need. Now, these methods we're going to be showing you are simply what work for us. We're definitely not master bowyers. We're not the best in the world, but we've been doing it for a while. These seem to work for us. We have some fairly nice shooting bows, and I'm sure the more bows you build, you'll develop your own style, you'll develop your own methods, and come up with something that you're comfortable with. You'll notice while we're doing this video, we're using several different bows in different stages during the process. And all that is just to help us move along with, without having to wait to finish one bow during the video. It shouldn't interrupt any of the understanding at all. You'll be able to look at what we're doing, no matter which bow we're using, and get a good feel for the concept. So why don't you sit back and enjoy this video, watch it a few times, make sure you understand what's going on, and let's get started. During the building process, we'll be using some terms and terminology that you may or may not be familiar with. So in order to get us on the same page right now, I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the parts of the longbow and explain some of the terms that I'll be using through the rest of the video. The center section here, the brown section, is the riser or handle section of the bow. Basically, that encompasses the sight window, the arrow shelf, the grip section, and out toward the ends of the handle where it tapers into the limb. Those are the fade outs. Those fade outs are real important. That's a critical part of the handle section, and I'll be spending quite a bit more time on that later on. Where they do fade out into the limb, you come to the working part of the limb, and that's about the middle 16 or 18 inches of this limb here. That's where you get all the power for your bow. Out at the end, you have the tips, where the string grooves are, or the nocks, and some tip overlays. And of course, it's just the same on the other end of the bow. Now when I talk about the bow, I'll be talking about the back of the bow, or the part that faces away from you when you draw the bow, and the part that faces you is the belly of the bow, or the part that's towards your belly is the belly of the bow. So that'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about, which side of the bow I'm talking about if I use those terms. Now the pieces required to put together a longbow are laying on the table here in front of me. Here's a rough cut riser section. I cut this out of a real pretty piece of canary wood, and I think that's going to make a real dandy handle for a bow coming up here pretty quick. I have 2 pieces of black glass, and these are 40 thousandths. And I have 3 sets of tapers. These just happen to be maple action wood, but you can use just about any kind of wood for your core woods on your limbs. These just happen to be something that's real strong and stable and fairly uniform the way they're put together. So they're a real good wood to start out with building your first bow or two.
You're going to need to construct a heat box or an oven to cure the bow after you glue it up. This is a simple box that I use. It's made out of 1/2-inch plywood, 7 feet long, approximately 2 feet high, and 1 foot wide. As you can see, I've lined the inside of it with a material called Reflectex, or you can use aluminum foil or something just to hold the heat in a little bit. You can get really elaborate with these things and put hinges on them and a thermostat. With this one, I actually just use a meat and poultry thermometer. Now, the heat source that I use for this box is 4 100-watt light bulbs. Those 4 100-watt light bulbs will heat this oven to about 170 degrees. And you can actually change different light bulbs and use different wattages and come up with a little bit different temperatures. I've made a little holder that the thermometer goes in. It's a very simple box. The hardest thing about having a heat box is deciding where to put it once it's made, because it takes up a lot of space.
Okay, once you've decided what you want your bow to be built out of, you can send off for the parts you're going to build it with. And while you're waiting on those, you need to build yourself a form. Now this is one of the forms that I use. I'm going to show you a couple of my different forms. This is made out of 3/4-inch plywood. It's 72 inches long, and it's a depth of about 7 inches. What I'd like to do is give you some of the measurements. This is a reflex form. Basically, it starts at one point in the center, and it reflexes out to both ends an equal amount. Now right here at the center of the bow, I have 7 inches. So you'll have a depth of 7 inches. Move out here to mid-limb, and it's about 6.5 inches. And move out here to the end, and it's about 5.5 inches. So as you can see, it starts here at the center and it gradually tapers off to the end. It does exactly the same thing on the other side. The way I did this is I took measurements, decided what I wanted my bow to reflex, and I started in the center, and about every 4 inches I took a measurement to get down to this taper. Went to the other side and I duplicated that, cut it out on a bandsaw at exactly this taper, took it over to the drum sander, and I smoothed the edges and put a piece of aluminum on the top so that I'd have a good solid gluing surface. You don't have to have aluminum on the top of these. Of course, you can put a piece of Formica on it. You can Bondo the holes in and just use the surface that you have right there on the plywood, as long as it's a good smooth surface, because your bow, the glass, will reflect any imperfections in your form. As far as my clamping system, I use a C-clamp system with these forms. I take the C-clamps and actually clamp them right in these holes and screw right down on top of the laminations. I do use pressure strips, as you'll see a little bit later on in the video, and what that does is just transfers the pressure a little bit out to the laminations and keeps from marring the surface of the fiberglass. Again, this is my reflex form, and I'll show you my deflex reflex form. This was built exactly the same way, 2 pieces of 3/4-inch plywood sandwiched together. And the measurements are a little bit different. You can see the shape of the bow is actually different. Start out here with a low handle. It deflexes back into the limbs and then reflexes back out toward the back of the bow. Right here in the center we start out, it's 5 inches. Out here at mid-limb we get 6 inches. And down here at the end we've got about 4 inches. So as you can see, we end up with about 1 inch of deflex and about 2 inches of reflex. It's exactly the same on the other end. And of course, I've drilled the holes here with the hole saw, and I've also put a long base on this one just to make it stable so that it doesn't tip while you're gluing up. On my other form, I just have a couple of feet, anything to keep it from tipping back and forth. This one also has the aluminum on top, and I find that that makes a pretty good solid gluing base. If you find that you don't want to invest in the C-clamps, you don't want to spend that money, you don't have access to them, I would like to take a second just to show you another form that Mike uses, and it's pretty easy to make, really inexpensive, and it works using the rubber band method or the inner tube method. You can use 1-inch strips cut from truck tire inner tubes. First thing you want to do is go out and buy you a sheet of 3/4 inch fiberboard. You want to cut a strip out of that is 6 inches deep and the full 72 inches long. Glue those two pieces together and you'll have a piece that's 1.5 inches thick, 6 inches deep, 72 inches long. Then you cut a piece that is 1.5 inches wide, 32 inches long, and you place that and you glue it and screw it right here on top of your base. That's 3/4 inches deep. Then you cut some 3/4 inch blocks. You put 2 3/4 inch blocks right here at this end, 1 3/4 inch block right in the center, and 2 3/4 inch blocks right on this end. And basically, that's what you'll have. These are all glued together. Then you take a piece of tempered hardboard and you'll screw that down right in the center here. And that piece is 72 inches long also. You take it right up here, screw it in here, and that tapers back to this end where you'll put another screw in. It also lays on top of here, goes right to this end, and you'll put screws in both of those connecting points. As you can see, that's taken the form of a deflex reflex bow. What you'll do with these hollow spaces here is you'll just fill those in. You can use plaster of Paris, that's real commonly used. Or you can use any kind of auto body filler or any kind of putty that will harden to fill those in. What that'll give you is a rock solid base to glue on, and this form will maintain the shape of your deflex reflex bow until you decide to get rid of it. When you get that shape and you get that all filled in with the Bondo, you can come down here and you can drill holes every 3 inches and put a 3/8 to a 1/2 inch dowel in these holes. And those dowels should extend out about 1 inch or 1.5 inches on either side of the form. And once you get your laminates glued up and get those laminates laid up on the form, you take your rubber bands or your inner tubes and you stretch them around these dowels, and they stretch over the form, over your bow to the other side and hook around the other dowels, back over and stretch back and forth, back and forth. And you'll need to have several dozen of these rubber bands or inner tubes because it takes several to apply the pressure that you're going to want to get to hold this bow down. And you're just going to end up with inner tubes or rubber bands back and forth all over this thing. This is a real inexpensive way to do it. Hundreds of thousands of bows have been built this way. It's real successful, so it's something that you might want to consider if you're just going to build a bow or two and not invest a lot of money in it. One place you're going to want to be real careful is right here at the fade outs and in the handle area where your bow goes up like so, and where your laminates have to lay in this curve here. You're going to want to put a lot of pressure on that, so add extra rubber bands right there. Because some of these rubber bands are going to break. They're under pressure, and then once you add that pressure to the heat in the heat box, you'll find that once you pull out that bow, it is going to have some of those rubber bands broken. But if you have enough of them on there, it'll maintain the pressure to keep that bow glued with good glue lines. So while you're waiting on your laminates to get here, go ahead, figure out what kind of form you want to use, and get to building that form. Get you a nice solid base to glue on, and once your stuff gets here, you're ready to start gluing it together.
It's time to cut out our riser. And before we do that, we need to actually put the shape of the riser that we're going to use on our block of hardwood. Now what I do, I use a template. Now this one's made out of plexiglass. And you'll see that the bottom is curved, the tops are curved. The bottom curve of this template is exactly the same curvature that's on our form. The sides, going up on both sides, which are perfectly symmetrical, gradually curve up to a 4-inch handle. Now if you don't have a template, and you may not want to make one, you can take your block of hardwood, put it on the form, and actually trace out the shape of your riser right off your form. I'm going to use a template. Now I've covered one side with masking tape just so I can see my pencil line a little better. Okay, I've laid the template on, and I'm going to trace Okay, the template's off. You can go ahead and you can see the shape of the riser right there. The bottom, remember, is the same line, the same curvature as your form, and the top just gradually curves up to your 4-inch handle. We'll go ahead and start the bandsaw up and cut this out. One thing to remember, again, we're not cutting directly to the line. We'll stay off the line a little bit and sand down to it. Let's give it a try. This riser is 18 inches from fade out to fade out. We will be using it on a 68-inch longbow. Here, I've cut out the riser, and you can see that I've tried to stay about 1/8 of an inch to 1/16 of an inch off of the line that we've drawn on the masking tape. And that gives us room to sand down to that line. You try to cut right down to that line, and you could end up with some divots in your riser that are a little bit tough to sand out. This is as far as we're going to go on the bandsaw. We'll take it over to the spindle sander and grind that down right to the line, and our riser should be done.
Now that you've got your block of wood cut out into the basic shape of a riser, we're going to have to do a little bit of sanding to get this uniformly shaped and ready to fit onto your form so that you can glue up. You can see that this riser here has been shaped to use with a reflex or a straight bow. It's got the flat bottom and of course the curved edges here that lead up into your fade outs. This riser here has been cut out, and this will be used with a deflex reflex form. And what we'll have to do if we use this one is we'll have to sand the bottom so that it perfectly fits the contour of that deflex reflex form. It's very critical that you don't have any gaps when you put this onto the form. What I'll use to do the sanding is I'll use this oscillating spindle sander, and what it'll do is it'll take the material off very uniformly and at a pretty good rate of speed, so you got to be careful when you're doing this. Don't have to use an oscillating spindle sander or any kind of spindle sander for that matter. You can use a drum sander on a drill press. You can use the round end of a belt sander. You can take it off by hand sanding, it's quite a chore, but it works. You just use what you've got available. One thing that you do want to make sure, no matter what you use, is that you keep the spindle or the grinder, you want to keep it square with your work. And what I do is every time I use this, I check. This table is attached to this spindle, so it's going to be square, but I always check it. And you can see there that everything is perfectly square, so my work is going to be square whenever I'm finished grinding on this. Make sure you do that with anything that you sand with. The critical parts of a riser are going to be the slopes here, and once you get down into the fade outs, this has to be paper thin. This will really have to come down, and you'll almost be able to see through it. You can see this is pretty good. It's going to have to, a little bit of more material is going to have to come off of that, and that's when you get right down to the finish work. The grit that I use a 70 or an 80 grit. It's a pretty rough grit, and what it does is it takes the material off at a pretty good pace, and it'll also give you a rough surface here for gluing. That glue will take a lot better to that rough surface than it would to something that was sanded really smooth and hard. So let's go ahead and fire this puppy up and see if we can't get this thing ready to glue. All right, that's what we're looking for. Looks like we've got some uniform surfaces, really smooth. They're still roughed up from the heavy grit paper. Going to be able to take to that glue good. And everything on the bottom here looks like it's curved and is going to fit right on our form. What I'll do is I'll grab that form, put it up here, and we'll check and make sure. Alright, now what you're looking for here is when the center of your riser is centered on the form, you want to get right down and look along the face of the form and the bottom of the riser, and there should be minute gaps or no gaps at all. The fewer the better, and the tighter that fits, the better your bow is going to glue up. On these surfaces here that go out to your fade out, once you get that on the form, you want to take a lamination and you want to lay it right on top of that. And what you're looking for is if you can apply light pressure with your fingers all the way along that, you want to make sure there are no gaps. Gaps are going to leave big holes in your glue lines, make a weak limb, and you're probably not going to like it. Do the same thing to the other side. It's kind of a theme that we're finding throughout this. If you do something to one side, you do it to the other. Run your fingers down that and give it even pressure, very light pressure, and it lays down with no gaps. So I think we're going to be happy with this one. Look out at the ends, you can see that tapers right out, fades out into a paper thin fade out. Hold it up to the light, you can almost see through it. I don't know if you can see that or not, but those are very thin. And this is a very critical part of the bow. Make sure you work on those until they're paper thin. I think a little bit of cleaning and wipe this down, it's going to be ready to glue. Okay, we're ready to start gluing up your bow now. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you step by step how you put one together and glue it up and get it in the oven. First thing I want to do is I want to go over a list of items that you'll need to have present, tools that you're going to be using to do this. You need to have your riser, your wood, and your fiberglass laminations. You'll need your form. Got to have some pressure strips, strapping tape, clear tape, some kitchen grade plastic wrap like saran wrap or some of those wraps. You'll need enough C-clamps if that's how you're going to do it, to do that, or any other pressure device you're going to use. Some wooden pressure blocks, your glue, a mixing bowl, and some spreaders. I just happen to use plastic putty knives that you can get real cheap at any department store or hardware store. As you can see, we've already gone through our dry run. It's very important that you do a dry run. Basically what that is we've laid out all the laminations and the riser on the form, put some pressure on the riser to make sure that it lays flat and that the contours are good, there's no big gaps. And then we just laid the other laminations on top of that and seen that everything's going to be laying good for us once we apply the pressure to it, so we're going to be pretty happy with this. The dry run is very critical. You don't want to start gluing up and get everything all sticky and find out that something doesn't fit right. Put it together, make sure it fits right, go through the process, and once you're happy with that, then go ahead and start laying the glue on, and you're in business. Okay, I'm going to take each lamination off of this bow in reverse order of how it's going to be glued up. I'm going to wipe it down with acetone and lay it back so it'll be ready to glue. Just a note, as you can see on the back of the fiberglass here, we've covered that with a clear tape. And what that'll do is that'll protect that surface from any glue if it should get on that during the gluing process. You won't have to sand it off and mar up the surface of your bow. So I'm going to pull these off and start wiping. Looks like Mike's coming along pretty good with the glue there. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're using?
The glue that we'll be using today is a two-part epoxy built specially for archery construction for building bows. Now there's a couple different brands out there in the market. This particular one mixes at a 50-50 ratio. You use the same amount of hardener as you do the resin. This one also dries clear. Word of caution out there, if you're going to build a bow with clear glass, this glue also comes in black. So you want to make sure that you use the clear glue if you're going to use clear glass, so you can see the grain of the wood.
All right, the next step is to get a little bit of paste wax. And you just want to lightly coat the top of the form. And just let it dry on there just like that. Don't even wipe it off. All that'll do is that'll protect your form. If any glue breaks through the plastic wrap and gets on your form, your bow will just pop right off of there.
Now once that dries, we'll take a sheet of plastic wrap and lay it over the whole form, and then we'll start gluing the laminations.
Yeah, that plastic wrap will act as a cocoon to catch all the glue that squishes out of your glue joints, so you won't have it running and dripping down over everything. And make sure that's laying flat on your form. Next thing we're going to do, start applying the glue to the laminations. Okay, Mike, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. I just take a little dab of the glue and spread it back and forth, making sure that you completely cover every bit of the lamination. Let's check each other's work and make sure there's no dry spots on it.
I see one right here.
And then you take that first lamination and lay it right in place, right on top of the plastic wrap. All right, once you get the one side coated, you just take those and roll them right over. Lay them right on top of your first piece of glass that you glued. I think you'll want to scoot that on into the center there, Mike. And you'll apply the glue to this piece on the other side, laying right on top of the form. Take your next lamination, repeat the process, lay it on the table, and glue one side, and lay it on top of the form and glue the other side. Okay, what Mike's doing here is he's going ahead and gluing up the bottom of the riser section. And once he makes sure there's no dry spots and that's fully coated with glue, he's going to set it right here and center it on the bow form. I'm going to take a clamp and we're going to clamp everything that's here so far into place. One more crank for luck. And that's not going anywhere. Go out and just make sure we'll push the ends down. And they are still right in line, right on top of the form. Everything look good there?
Yep, I think so. The bow that we're gluing up today, it's got a Bacote riser. It's got or it has a parallel of bamboo in it, which is the one thick piece right here, tempered bamboo. And then that'll be sandwiched between two pieces of Osage that are tapers under clear glass. The tapers that we're using out of the Osage have a butt thickness of 120 thousandths and taper to, or a 2 thousandths taper per inch.
Okay, this is the last wood lamination that'll be going on. Next step will be to coat the top of this. Then apply glue to the last piece of fiberglass, the belly glass. And the gluing is just about finished. Wearing these rubber gloves while you're gluing is actually a pretty good idea. It makes it real easy to wash your hands when you're done. You peel them off and throw them in the garbage. Just remember that the selection of your lambs in fiberglass is very important. There are many different types and they come in any dimensions that you want. So consult with a traditional supplier and see if he can help you determine the material and thicknesses for your desired poundage. Now let's take this plastic wrap and you just bring it up and over and you enclose the entire bow in your plastic wrap. And I'll apply one here. And if you'll do the same thing here, Mike, if you'll wrap that. And press down on the lambs so that they push down onto your riser fade out. Okay, are they good and straight?
They're straight.
All right. Let's tighten it up then. There we go. Okay. Everything looks good there. Just take the ends and you can just pull them up over and lay them right on top there. They're not gonna let any glue out the end down there. Next thing you apply is you take your cork pressure strip, just lay it right on top there. And then there's a metal pressure strip that I put on top of that. And those will lay just fine.
Now at home I use a piece of rubber, like conveyor belting. It's kind of a soft rubber.
Sure, that'll work
real
too.
well too.
You bet. All right, and the next thing we'll do is get our clamps out and get those lined up like we're going to use them. All right, I'm going to start right here at the fade out and apply my first clamp. Mike, if you'll make sure all my lambs are staying straight down there. I'm going to put that in from this side. And put that on there and snug it up.
Well, Mike, how much pressure are you using on the clamp?
Well, right now I'm just snugging them up. Later on you're going to want to clamp them down pretty tight. And I can't really give you a set pressure that works for that. It's just a feel thing that I've done, and been lucky I haven't had any dry glue joints, so that's about all I can tell you. I don't know that there's any specific torque that anybody puts them down at. I know if you use the the air hose method, they use 70 pounds or so. But just, I get them pretty tight because I want to make sure that those joints are good and tight. But I don't tighten them up enough to where I'm going to be getting a dry glue joint. Make sure nothing moves.
All right.
Okay. Now we'll just work our way right down the limb. And I alternate sides. You can go ahead and do that on this end. I'll do it on this end if you want, Mike. I alternate sides back and forth using the wood block. All that is just a pressure spreader. it's just a block of hardwood. Really anything would work that wouldn't give under the pressure of the clamp.
Mike, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit. These clamps, I like the way this goes together. How far apart are your centers for your clamps?
They're about 4-inch centers on those holes. I just drilled them with a hole saw. And I didn't want them too close together. And that's part of the reason I use these wooden blocks as spreaders, is so that it'll spread the pressure out evenly over the surface of the limb. And I just went to some local stores and bought the C-clamps. They're actually relatively inexpensive. And pretty easy to use. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'll go down these and I'll check the pressure. And again, I'm not going to be able to tell you what pressure to do these with.
Now you can actually see the glue push out from between the seams.
You bet. The glue will squish out. And you're going to want them fairly tight so that you know you're getting good good contact on your laminations. And just grab it by that last form or clamp.
Right inside.
All right. Okay, this bow's cooked about 5 hours, and we've let it cool gradually overnight, so it's back to room temperature. I'm going to go ahead and pull that form out and unclamp this thing, see how it looks. All right. Go ahead and start from the center, Mike, and we'll work out. You get that side, and I'll get this side. Come off here pretty easy. Alright, now these pressure strips ought to just peel right off of here. And this cork, you just kind of run a finger under it there and it'll might catch right there at the tape, but just run a finger under it. Cut our tape.
All right.
And peel that tape off of there. And with any luck, it ought to pop right off of there. All right, beautiful. Look at that Osage shine. What you can do now is you just go ahead and peel this plastic wrap off of here. Get right down to the real nitty-gritty. All right, we've got her off the form, and we've got it cut the length. The next step is to grind all these glue boogers here off the bow. Give us some smooth surfaces to work with on the sides here. This glue, when it comes out of the oven, it is rock hard. I don't know if you can see or not how tough that stuff is, but it's like glass. It'll cut you, so you want to make sure you get this off. Whenever I'm grinding or cutting with this stuff, I always wear leather gloves and try to wear some kind of respirator so that I don't inhale any of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and put my gear on and do a little bit of grinding on this. All right, there you have it. What we've got is we've got some square edges now on this. All those glue boogers are about gone. You can see your glue lines, gives you your first chance to look at your glue lines and see how well everything's fitted together. Looks like this is going to be pretty good. I'm going to be happy with this. Still a little excess glue on there, but it's not all gummed up on the side like it was before. What this will do is this will give us a flat surface that we can lay our straight edge on when we scribe out our bow for cutting out. A little bit of glue, you know, the riser here is a little bit wider than the lambs, so we got a little glue on the sides there, but that's not built up at all and it's not going to affect it. The next thing we're going to want to do is scribe a bow shape on this and cut it out on the bandsaw. Before you do that, if you remember that tape that we put on as a protective coating, that's still on there, and you're going to want to take a pocket knife or something and pick at that a little bit. And you're going to want to peel that off of there. That should come right off the full length of the bow. It may come in a few pieces, but it's pretty easy to get off of there. It's served its purpose, and we're finished with it now. So go ahead and get that tape off of there, and we'll get the scribe and draw us out a bow. All right, now that you've got all the tape off of the surface of the fiberglass, what you want to do is find your new center line on your bow. When you were doing all that grinding, you ground off the center line, so go to each end of the riser, out to the fade outs, and measure that length. Then cut that in half. That's your center. You can scribe it on your, or just actually mark it with a pencil on your riser, and mark it across the top of your bow right there on the fiberglass. Just use a pencil. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and scribe the bow out on this rough blank. And to do that, we're going to need a few tools. We're going to start with a 36-inch ruler or a straight edge. It doesn't necessarily have to be a ruler, but it does need to be a good, strong straight edge. I'm going to use a sharp scribe to run along that straight edge and make a good, clean line in the bow. I've got a 6-inch ruler here that has some real finite graduations in it so that I can make sure that I'm getting good, precise measurements. I want to be real precise at this point. A pencil to make a couple of your marks. And I've got some clamps to hold that straight edge in place while I'm scribing. And these clamps happen to have rubber pads over the jaws so that when you clamp onto your bow, it doesn't eat into your fiberglass and cause any abrasions you're going to have to sand out later. So that's something you might want to think about before you start clamping on your fiberglass. One last tool that you're going to need, you're going to have to make yourself. I haven't seen it in any of the hardware stores yet. And it works on the same principle as a plumb bob. Basically, you need a piece of string, 80 inches long, and a couple of weights to tie onto the end of it. And we'll be laying that across the bow to find a center line on our bow so that we can work from that center line. If you've got all of these items right here, then we're ready to go ahead and scribe a bow. Let's get to it. Okay, what I use for the center of my bow, I'm going to use a 13-inch rectangle, and I'm going to take that from the center. So I'm going to measure 6.5 inches each side of the center line. And I'm just going to go down there, and I'm going to make a mark at 13 inches. And I'm going to go back to the other side and make a mark at 0. So what that does is that just gives me the end of the rectangle in my handle where I'm going to start to taper out to the tips from. And there. All right. The next thing I need to do is find center line so that I can work from either side and middle out when I make my measurements for this bow. Mike, why don't you grab the end of this plumb bob and let's go ahead and line this up. We'll find a center on this bow here. And that looks pretty darn close to where we're going to be able to get a center out of. You good down there?
Looks good.
Okay. That is now going to be the center of our bow. I'll take this scribe and I'm going to mark right under the end of that so that that is now permanently our center. Move that back to there. And once again, I'm doing the same thing on both ends of the bow. So we have our two center lines on the end. The next thing I need to do is I need to get directly above the bow, and I need to find my center underneath this string. And that's what I'm doing here. And I now have my center line at those 3 points under that string. And if you get at the end of the bow and look down, all 3 of those lines should line up right under your string, giving you a center. Okay, we're all finished with our handy dandy homemade tool here. It has served its purpose. We'll use it again later once we're finished scribing to check. That makes that panic go away when you're checking. And the next thing we're going to do is make our marks for this centerpiece. All right. Now what I've done is I've gone ahead and scribed out the box here in the center of the bow. And the way I got these measurements is I took my rule and I wanted this to be 1.25 inches wide. So at my 3 center line marks, I went to 5/8. Put 5/8 at center, and to one side I went to 0. The other side I went to 1.25 inches. Same thing, I went to the middle, 5/8 in the center, so I went to 0 and to 1.25 inches. And on this one I went to 5/8, scribed over at 0 and scribed at 1.25 inches. And what we did is we laid out that straight edge, lined those 3 lines up, and zapped our line. So what we've got is we've got this box right here in the center, and that's going to form the handle of your bow. The next thing we're going to do is scribe in the limbs, and I'll go to the tips, and I want my tips to start out at 3/4 of an inch wide. That gives me a lot of wood to work with. So I'm going to measure 3/8 from each side, make a mark, and then I'll taper from this center, and I'll taper out to those marks. So I'm going to go ahead and make those measurements. I'm going to come to this end and find my center at 3/8. And I'm going to make a mark at 0. And I'm going to make a mark at 3/4. How about that? I'm going to go to the other end. And I'm going to make my mark. Find center with 3/8. Make a mark at 0. And make a mark at 3/4. And that will be the width at my tips. Okay.
Now this bow is how long, Mike?
This is a 66-inch bow. It's already been cut to length. Of course, we cut that to length before we even started the grinding. So we're going to take this straight edge and we're going to clamp it right on the mark, right here at our handle. And we're going to clamp it right on the mark, out at our tip. And we're going to put a couple of security blanket clamps right here in the middle, so I feel good about it. Because a line scribed in fiberglass is forever.
There you go.
Alrighty.
Mike, how hard are you pushing down on that scribe?
Well, just lightly enough to get a good solid line that I can see when I'm cutting. And not so hard that I'm trying to push all the way through the fiberglass. All I'm trying to do is get a line that I can use as a line to cut with the bandsaw. Okay, let's have a look at that. All right. There's one. And we'll turn it around. Line her up for me if you would.
There we go. Right there.
All right. All right. right, so it looks like we've got our lines. I'm going to look at it from the end here. And I like what I see, Mike. I see a straight bow out of the middle of this blob. Let's stick that plumb bob back on it. And again, it's too late to do anything about this, but it makes me feel better when I see this string going right down the middle of that bow I just drew. And that's exactly what I see. Got good lines. It goes right down the middle.
Looks like it cuts it perfect.
Yeah, we are ready to cut this puppy out. It is bandsaw time. Hope you had as much luck as we did. All right, we're getting to the part that I like best now, and that's the part where you actually get to start cutting things out and shaping them by hand. Let's go back and check those lines one last time before we cut, because that cutting, that's a pretty final thing. We've made our handle section 13 inches long. It's 1 1/4 inches wide. From each end of that handle section, we've started a line that tapers from 1 1/4 inches out the end of our 66-inch limb, and it'll taper out to 3/4 of an inch. It works that way out to both ends. Measure that one more time and double check it. Make sure that you've got it exactly right, and then we'll go ahead and cut out. Make sure you're wearing your safety gear anytime you use any power tools. You always want to make sure that you try and cut outside the line. Never want to cut inside that line. You can always sand to it. Now this fiberglass, it's extremely abrasive, so make sure that you have a good quality blade on your saw before you start cutting. Okay, now that we've got it cut out down just outside the line, I'm going to put it on the sander. Get those lines where the edge is sanded right down to the line. Make sure everything is straight. Have good smooth lines. I'm going to run it along here and clean everything up so that we can go scribe some trap lines in it. Get my safety gear on here and we'll get started. Whenever I'm working with this fiberglass, I always try to wear a respirator. I'm bad enough shape as it is. I don't need that in my lungs. All right, here we go. Okay, that's pretty clean. Looks like we're ready to go ahead and scribe some lines on. Got good straight lines on my limbs. And everything looks pretty square. When I start to shape my limbs, the first thing I do is I'll take a scribe and I'll make a mark 1/8 of an inch in from each edge of the limb. I'll make a line here in the handle all the way out to the tip of the bow 1/8 of an inch. Do that on both sides of the limb. Then what I'll do is I'll go out and of course I'll do it to the other side of the bow. Everything that we do to one end of the bow we do to the other. Go to the sander and remove all that material from this line at an angle back to the very edge of the belly of the bow. What that does is that gives me a trapezoidal shape on the limb, making the back of the bow 1/4 of an inch skinnier than the belly of the bow. I think it makes a smoother shooting bow, and I also think it takes away some of the hand shock by removing limb material. Okay, the way you want to do this is you want to take a rule and a scribe, go to the edge of your limb, and just make a mark 1/8 of an inch in on both sides. Go out to the tip of the limb. Make a mark the same distance from the edge. And go to the other side of the bow and do the same thing. Okay, once you've got your marks, take your 36-inch straight edge, and just like we did when we scribed out the shape of our bow, I'm going to clamp that straight edge right along those marks. Making sure that we're right on the line. This is another one of those deals where you're making a big scratch on your bow. So you want to make sure it's right. Okay, double check to make sure that we're on the lines, and we'll scribe a line. Man, I hate that sound. Okay. We'll repeat that 3 more times. Always being careful to stay right on the marks. Okay. Now, as you can see on the limbs, we've got those lines scribed, both sides. And that'll give us a good mark to follow when we start sanding. All right, now we've got our lines here on the front of the limb. This is actually the back of the bow, and as I said, we're going to be trapping from the back to the belly at an angle so that the back ends up 1/4 of an inch skinnier than the belly. The way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to lay it right on this belt sander and drag it right along there as smoothly as possible and keep that at as straight an angle as I can so that I don't get any waves in my limb. I think it'll make a little more sense once you see it and once we have the finished product. Okay, got it ground down, ground into the lines, and then tapered to the belly of the bow. If we can get a close-up, can we get one of the cameras in here to look at that so you can see good and close how that goes down? And what that's done is that's made the back of the bow about 1/4 of an inch skinnier than the belly of the bow. And once again, the belly of the bow is that portion of the bow that faces you when you're drawing it. And that continues all the way out to the end on both sides. And you can see the belly of the bow is still full width. Back of the bow is skinnier because I've put that trapezoidal shape on the limb, making this side skinnier. Next thing we're going to do, finish cutting some nocks in it here, string it up, and do a little bit of tillering on it. When I start to cut the rough string grooves in my bow, the first thing I'll do is make a couple of marks to give me a good mark to cut by. And I'll go to the back of the bow or the top of the limb as it's laying here. And I'll go to the very end, and I'm going to measure in 1 inch, make a mark on both sides, and I'll go to the belly of the bow or over on the back, and I'll come in 1 1/4 inches on both sides. And make a mark. Then I'll go to the side of the bow, and I'll just lay the ruler between those 2 marks. Draw a line. And what that does, it gives me a nice angle to cut that string groove so that that string will lay nice in it once the bow is strung. That's not the only way to do that. That just happens to be the angle that I use, and it works good for me, so maybe you'll have some luck with it. In keeping with our basic theme, whatever we do to one end, we're going to do to the other, so bear with me while I make some measurements here. Same thing, got 1 inch on top. And I'm going to do 1 1/4 inch on the bottom. Go to the side and make my line. Just connect the dots. It's about how tough this longbow building is. You just connect the dots. Okay. All right, those look good. Now I'm going to take a 6-inch round file, and I'm going to go ahead and cut some shallow nocks in that so that I have a place to put the string so that I can string it up and see what kind of shape my limbs are in as far as tiller. You can see I've placed some masking tape over the fiberglass. As I start filing, I want to be really careful. I don't want to be splintering the glass, because as you push across the glass from this side, it'll be okay, but when you push it out the other side, it has a tendency to splinter that glass. So you want to be real careful. I put that tape on there to help subdue that splintering, and also just try to be real careful with my file. So file right on that line. Once again, we're cutting big holes in this beautiful bow that we've glued up. Knock doesn't have to be real deep to hold a string at this point. see I'm drawing from the other side. That way I'm being real careful not to splinter the glass. There, that's good for that side. Now I'll go right to the other side and do the same thing and follow this line. Taking my time to make sure that those come out even. Now, as you can see, I've got those cut in there about the same depth and at approximately the same place because I had my lines drawn the same on both sides. And once again, I'll go down to the other end of the bow and do the same thing. All right, those look pretty even. I think I'll go ahead and try to put a string on that and see what I can learn about my limbs. Okay, sighting down the limbs of the bow. Appears to be tracking pretty good down the middle of the limbs. Limbs appear to be fairly straight. Nothing we can't take out with a little bit of sanding. Next thing I want to do is check the tiller. Basically, that's going to determine which is the top and which is the bottom limb so that I'll know where to cut my sight window and start my handle. And the way I like to do that is I like to take a ruler and go out right to the fade outs, right to the end of the fade outs. Take a measurement to the string. And that one is 5 15/16. And that one is 5 3/4. Telling me that this limb is probably going to be my bottom limb. It's a little stiffer. About 1/4 of an inch, not quite 1/4 of an inch. Another way to tell for sure, I've got a little tool here that I made myself. It's called my tiller stick. It's 18 inches long. Basically what I do with that is I will take it, try and draw my bow and get this stick to keep this bow drawn. So that I can take that same measurement and see if anything changes with the dynamic tiller. And that's what I call that. I call it dynamic tiller because it's when the bow is drawn. Take that same measurement and I get 16 3/4. Go here and I get 16 1/2, which tells me this is going to be my bottom limb. This is going to be my top limb. And basically, that's about all there is to that for now. So if this is going to be a right-handed bow, this is going to be my top limb. My sight window will come out here. My shelf will be cut here. And I'll know where to start making my initial cuts to put my handle in there. If you decided you want to use tip overlays on your bow, now is the time to apply those. When I do a tip overlay on my bow, the first thing I do is I tape off an area about 2.5 inches down my limb from the very tip, and that's where I'm going to apply my overlay. I'll take a piece of medium grit sandpaper and I'll go ahead and sand all the shiny surface off the fiberglass. What that is a protective coating. Sand that off so that the glue will stick and adhere to the fiberglass and the wood. Then I take and I cut a piece of hardwood. A lot of times I'll use the same wood the riser's made out of. Other times I'll use a piece of hardwood that'll contrast with the limb or with the fiberglass. This happens to be a piece of cocobolo. It's real pretty wood, and that should make a nice overlay. You want to take that, cut it out in a semi-wedge, not too steep or you won't be able to clamp it. Put it on the belt sander and smooth out the base of it so that it's a flat base that's going to lay flat right on your tip end. And I'll take that, do a dry run, make sure everything's going to look good. Then I'll acetone both surfaces off, mix up some more of the glue that I used, the same glue that I used to glue up the bow, just enough to put these overlays on, and apply that glue to both surfaces. Take the overlay and lay it right on the end of the limb. I just use a wood block that I put underneath. What that does is that keeps from marring the fiberglass again. It gives me something to use these clamps on so that I'm not screwing up the surface of my bow. Take a small C-clamp and clamp that right to the end of the bow. I take another small C-clamp and put it on the front. So that I've got equal pressure throughout this overlay. And once I'm sure I've got those cinched down good and tight, I'll go to the other end of the bow and do the same thing to the other limb. And once I get them both glued on, I'll put it back in my heat box and I'll cook it at a reduced temperature. I usually cook my overlays at about 100 degrees for 3 to 3.5 hours. And the way I do that is I usually just turn off a couple of light bulbs. Leave that in there. It'll have to cool gradually back to room temperature. And then you can pull it out. You can take a look at your overlays. And you'll find that that's going to provide a real nice contrast. It's going to add a little bit of strength to the end of that limb. And you're going to be real happy with the beauty that's going to add to your bow. This is going to be a real nice piece here. This dark wood contrasts real nice with the light colors in that wood and that glass. You don't absolutely have to use hardwood. You can also use a piece of horn or a piece of antler. You can use linen micarta. There's several things you can use for these overlays, and most of them are real pretty and add a nice touch to the bow. So if you decide you want to do this, this is the time you want to do that step. It's real simple, and I think you'll be happy with the results. And I think we'll make the measurements. For that sight window and shelf. One of the things I do is find center on my riser. Basically, you just go to the fade outs, measure back to the center. So that's going to be approximately there. And then I go 2 inches up from center, and that is going to be where my shelf is approximately. That's where I'll make the initial cut, then I'll do some more filing after that. And about 3 1/4 inches up from there will be the top of my sight window. This is not chiseled in stone. These are measurements that I like to use. You can experiment, make your sight window longer, shorter. It's up to you. Now, when I make this measurement, check the width. And I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch this side of center cut. So when I do that, gives me room to file without going over center on this bow. I just draw a line from the top of my window to where I want that to meet my shelf. And your sight window will be here, your shelf will meet it there, and that's going to be the cutout. Now this particular bow, like I said, it's going to have a pretty deep throat in it. I'm using a handle that this gentleman wanted me to copy. And I'm going to trace the rough shape of that, and I'll make those cuts on the bandsaw also. And then I'll do some filing and shaping in order to get that to rough in. And I am ready to take this to the bandsaw. Make some of these cuts. And then we really start the fun work with the file. Now that's going to be the basic shape cut out. As you can see, everything's real square edges. It's going to take quite a bit of filing and sanding here. You can do most of this surface sanding here on the spindle sander or on a belt sander. What I'm going to do is, you're not watching this video to watch me file for an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and I've got another bow over here that I've done some more work on. And basically what I did was I've done some contouring here with a sander and a file. And what you're wanting to do is take a little bit of material off the sides here to start to round it so that it fits into your hand a little bit better, and start getting the general shape. This is where some of the artwork comes in. This is my favorite part. I feel like you're sculpting a little bit. This is a bow I've got a little more work done on. As you can see, the edges have started to round and contour a little bit, starting to take some of the shape. Getting the scallops on the edge of the limbs here. Got some work to do on the sight window yet. And still a little bit to do here in the handle. I've got a front overlay on this particular bow. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few more passes with my spindle sander. Round this just a little bit more. And then I'll make a few passes with a file just to give you an idea of how you want to make these cuts. And from there it's pretty much your imagination. Let me fire up this spindle sander and see if I can't make a couple passes on that. Now it's starting to round out just a little bit better now. Has a pretty nice feel in the hand. As you can see, it's just basically making passes back and forth on that sander. There's no tried and true or specific way to do it. It's your imagination, and this is where you kind of get to be an artist. Now some of these places here you're not going to be able to get to, obviously, with the drum on the spindle sander. So you're going to have to do a little bit of work by hand on this. A couple of tools that I use when I'm doing that work is I just use a plain old 8-inch mill bastard file, and for some of the other work I use what's called a 4-way, and basically it's got 4 different files on it. It's got a flat file, a rounded file, a flat rasp, and a rounded rasp, and I'll use all of those from time to time. The rasp they'll move a little bit more material than the file will. Now when you want to start making these cuts, anytime you're working with fiberglass like that, you want to cut with the fiberglass so that you're not splintering it. So when I'm going to round this side of the sight window, I'll start filing in that way. And I'll start that with this little file here. Same thing with the other side. Just want to cut with the glass, pushing toward the wood so that it doesn't splinter the glass. As you can see, the scallop on the bottom of the upper limb there is already starting to take place. What I'm doing is I'm putting a radius on the sight window here. And basically it's going to give a single point of contact for the arrow to strike. You want to make sure that you have a slight radius in the sight window. And I'm going to do the same thing with the arrow shelf. It's not going to be flat like that. It's going to have a slight radius in it so that the arrow touches just in two places right there, in the sight window and on the shelf. All right, that's really starting to take a nice shape there. You can see starting to get the nice point there on the back of the upper limb. Starting to get a radius in the sight window and also on the shelf there. It's going to be a really nice handle. I'm not gonna stand here and file for you for 2 hours. This is something you have to just go sit down somewhere on a stool and work on this a little bit at a time. It'll start to take shape, and you can just make a piece of art out of it. It'll be your own work. I've got another bow over here that's a little bit farther along, and it's basically going to show you where that's going to go. As you can see, I've done quite a bit more work with the file on this one. I've got it contoured and rounded quite a bit, both on the top and the bottom. You know, the nice grip there, semi-pistol grip. Got a little groove for the finger. Real good radius on the shelf. And the sight window is nice and radius so that there's only 2 contact points for that arrow. Basically, you just do all the rounding here so that it feels good in your hand. You know, you can just take it a little bit at a time. Make sure you take off what you want off, because it's real easy to take it off, but it's tough to put it back on. I haven't been able to put any back on yet. And it's the same thing with the tips. I've been working on the tips here a little bit too. And you can see that I've got them blocked out, just basically roughed in. And the way you do that, you just take your round file, make your string grooves, and then you start working on everything with your flat file. Sanding those, filing those. And what you end up with is something similar to this, or the shape that you choose. This is the shape that I like to use here. It's got a nice string groove in it, plus it's got a real contoured point. Give you kind of a comparison of those two. And you can see that with just a little bit of work, that you can make a real nice looking tip. And again, this is the fun part of building the bow. There's really no way that I can take you by the hand and show you how to do that. I can just show you basically what I do. You're going to make some mistakes, you're going to do a little trial and error, but it's a lot of fun, and I think you'll be happy with the way it turns out. If you have a picture of a bow or another bow laying around that you can look at while you're cutting these and shaping them, it helps tremendously. You know, I think as you start to see the shape take place, it'll be a little bit easier for you to start taking the material off and getting comfortable with that idea. But basically just take your time, file slow, stop and look at it. Every once in a while, go ahead and string the bow up and make sure that you've got your grooves cut straight so that you're not pulling the limb off to one side or the other. And pretty soon you'll have a real nice looking bow that's ready to start the finishing sanding on. Another way to take this material out, a lot of bowyers use, is with a 1-inch strip sander. And here's a bow here that Mike is working on. And he's cut this window and shelf out using just a 1-inch strip sander. Basically, he just works it and contours it, and you don't get any severe lines there like you get when you cut it with the bandsaw. Works real good. Either way is fine. If you've got a strip sander, you might want to try this. If not, the files work also. So if you take your time, work on that. That's kind of the fun part.
Freight train.
Okay, one of the final steps in shaping your bow is going to be to get your limbs in tiller. And by that I mean making sure that the top limb is just a little bit weaker than the bottom limb. You want to go to the end of your fade out and measure from the limb up to your string, go to the fade out on the bottom limb, measure from the fade out to the string, and the bottom limb should be 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch less than the measurement on the top limb. Now if your bow doesn't have that, one way to do that is to take material off the belly of the limb, actually take fiberglass off, get a sanding block, just like this here, and you can use a medium grip, about a 150, and you can actually just go and sand in strokes like that, and actually take material right off the fiberglass. And you don't want to take a whole lot of strokes because that takes the material off pretty quick, and it will go ahead and bring that limb in. Go slow, be careful, and don't take too much off of it. Now this is one step in the bow where you may not want to do the same thing to the other end of the bow that you do to one end. You want to make sure that these measurements are coming out like you want them. The top should be 1/8 to 1/4 more than the bottom. When you've got them in tiller like you want them, go ahead and check it for limb alignment. The way you do that is to look down the limb from nock to nock with the string centered over the sight window and see if that string follows right down the center of the limb, nock to nock. If it doesn't, there's a couple ways to fix that. First thing I would do is I would go and check my nocks and make sure that they're even. If you've cut a string groove too deep on one side, you might want to deepen up the other side and try to even them out. That's another thing you want to be real careful and go slow. You will have to take the string off to do that, of course. But go slow, put the string on, take it off, put it on, and take just a little bit of material at a time. If you're sure that your nocks are straight and even, the next step is to go to the sides of the limb, here on the side, and you'll want to start taking material off of the strong side. In other words, on this limb, if it's leaning to this side, this would be the strong side, so you want to take material off this side of the limb. Same thing, you can do it with a sanding block, you can do it with a file, you can actually lay that right down and you can take material off with the file, and you can watch that string pull that limb right back into center. You can leave the string on for this procedure, and I would recommend it because you can actually watch the limb correct itself. Now those are the two ways that I straighten up limbs, and if you take your time and make sure that your nocks are straight and take material off the limb slow, you're going to find that you've got a good straight limb and your string is tracking straight right down that. If your bow comes in a little heavier than you want, the same thing. You can take material off the glass. I always start on the belly and take material off the belly. And if you've got your bow and tiller already, you're going to want to take the same amount of strokes off the top as you do off the bottom. You just take your sanding block, take a couple strokes up here, turn it over, take a couple strokes down here. Once you check that, check your poundage, make sure that that bow's in where you want it. Then I leave that alone. The only other sanding I do on the glass is when I'm sanding it down to get this protective coating off so that I can apply my finish. One last step that I do when I'm tillering my bows is I take an 18-inch tillering stick, and all that is a piece of wood with grooves cut in each end. And I actually draw my bow, set that string right on the handle, pick that bow up, and do the same thing. I look right down the limbs, and I make sure that the string is tracking down the limbs while the bow is drawn. This is called the dynamic tiller. And if your bow's put together right, this should not change. The string should stay in line even when you draw the bow. Basically, that's all there is to tillering. Take your time, get those string grooves even, check for your string tracking, check your poundage, and you're ready to do some finish sanding, get this thing ready to shoot. Got my limbs like I want them. Mike, why don't you come on in here and let's talk about putting some finish on these bows so we can get them out and shoot them a little bit. Once you get your bow tillered and get the limbs like you want them, and you've got the handle shaped, sight window shaped, shelf shaped, everything's just like you want it, the next step is to go ahead and do the finish sanding. Now when I start my finish sanding, the first thing I do is I'll take a 150 grit, maybe 100 grit, depending on how many file marks I have in it, and I'll smooth out the riser and the handle section, and I'll get all the file marks out of it. I'll go to the ends of any overlays that I applied, and I'll make sure that those are smooth, and I'll actually take the sandpaper and I'll blend those right into the glass. You're going to be sanding on this glass anyway, so don't be worrying about scratching it. You just want to sand with the contour of the limb. Go out to these overlays, same thing. I take my sandpaper and I make sure those blend smoothly in with the glass. Make sure you sand all your knocks, and this is using the rougher grit sandpaper that you're wanting to get everything just smooth so you don't have any file marks. Now when I complete that, and I'm pretty happy with all my beginning sanding, little trick that I use, since I try to be kind of a stickler on my finishing, so I've got just a little magnifying glass. It's kind of almost a toy magnifying glass. I picked it up at a 5 and dime store, and I'll take that and I'll actually go over every inch of the bow, right up and down the limbs. I'll go to the tips and look at the overlays and the string grooves. I'll come back down, I'll go over the handle and look at everything. And if I find places on there that I'm not happy with, if I find a file mark or if I find a dip, I'll go ahead and circle that with a pencil, make sure I can find it after I'm finished. And I'll go over the rest of the bow, circling every file mark that I find, and I'll go back and I'll sand that smooth. Once I'm happy that I've got all those marks out, I'll come back and check it one more time. Then I'll go ahead and hit it with a 200 grit sandpaper, go over the complete bow. I'll hit it with a 400 grit sandpaper, making sure that everything is smooth and starting to come in, with a real nice smooth finish. And then I'll hit it with a steel wool, like a 4/0 steel wool. I'll go over the complete bow, glass and all, and that's when I'm ready to finish. I take that steel wool, I rub down the handle, I rub down the glass, I go to the tips. Same thing, I go over the entire bow. Once I'm satisfied that it's smooth just like I want it, then I take a rag and I wet it with acetone and I wipe the whole bow. And what that does is that gets any wood shavings, it gets any glass slivers, any oil from my hands. Always when you're using acetone too, you want to wear the rubber gloves. That not only keeps the acetone out of your skin, but it also keeps your oil off the bow that you're getting ready to finish. Now usually when I finish a bow, I'll take it and I'll hang it up by the bottom knock using a piece of real thin safety wire, and I'll just let it hang in front of me, like so. And I finish a bow a couple ways. I've got several polyurethanes that I use. And some tongue oil that I use for different finishes. Yeah, why don't you grab that too, Mike? Let's look at that. A lot of my early bows I did with tongue oil. It was a hand-rubbed tongue oil finish. And the way I do that is I just pour the lid full of tongue oil, dip my finger in it, and I actually just rub it over the whole bow. I hand rub it in with my fingers. I'll take it and I'll rub it in all over the whole bow, set it off to the side for 5 or 10 minutes, then I'll take a rag and I'll wipe off the excess tongue oil, let that dry. And I'll apply 2 or 3 coats that way, and then I'll letter it, and then I'll apply a couple more coats. Now if you're going to try this tongue oil method, and it is the easiest, it makes a real nice deep rich finish, and it's real easy to apply. You don't have to worry about runs, you don't have to worry about an area to spray in. Make sure you use 100% tongue oil. There's a lot of tongue oil varnish out there and different tongue oil finishes that are actually sticky, and they will dry before you can actually get them on and wiped off the bow. I don't like to use those. I like to use 100% tongue oil. I don't know what you found, but
100% is the best.
yeah, okay. If I'm working, I work with a lot of cocobolo, which is a real oily wood. So in order to get a good finish on that using a spray-on finish, I use a 2-part clear penetrating epoxy sealer. And the way I do that is I mix that up in a small cup, and I actually brush it on the cocobolo so that it can seal in the oils. Then I can sand that, and then I can spray. And I like to use polyurethane. I've got a couple of different brands here that I use, some Minwax, some of this Helmsman spar varnish, some Flectoverathane. They all work real good. Deft works real good. Just pretty much any of the better quality polyurethanes will work good. I find that they give a real nice finish. I use satin myself. I don't like a bright bow, a shiny bow. I think that it's much nicer to have a dull bow when you're out in the woods.
One thing I found, if I'm finishing a bow with a spray finish, that I will actually put on a coat and use that, go back to that steel wool and hit it again a couple times.
Sure, yeah. I still wool between coats. Basically what that does is that sands off any airborne particles that happen to stick to your bow, or just any irregularities in the finish as you sprayed it on. I also, once I get a couple of coats on the bow, I'll steel wool it down a little bit, and that's when I do my lettering. I don't know if you folks are going to be very much into lettering your bows. Everybody likes to put a name on them. They like to put their name on them, showing that they did it.
It's nice to maybe number your bow if it's your first one, and the date you finished it.
I've tried a couple of different methods with this. I've used highlighters, markers, whatever you want to call them, felt tip pens, the permanent ones. Make sure that if you do use a felt tip pen, that you test it on some of the material that you've cut off the end of your bow. They do tend to run and spread out through some of these grainier woods.
At some of the art stores, you can get those real fine point permanent markers, and I've had real good luck with those if I'm not going to use ink.
Sure. What I've gotten to do lately is I've got a little bit fancier, and I went to the art store and I picked up just a artist pen and a nib and some India ink. Whatever you do, don't let the dog get a hold of this and drag it all over the house, because it comes out of nothing. This stuff is permanent. What I did was I went out and picked up a pen and some ink, and I practiced for about a week, scribbling on pads of paper, writing on blocks of wood, until I got satisfied that that I had a good enough penmanship to go ahead and start writing on these bows with this pen. Now you can do it just about anywhere you want. One common place on a lot of bows is in the handle section here, just below the grip. On either side, people like to write there. I do most of my stuff right here on the bottom limb. I'll start here, and I write a little paragraph that comes up the limb, and I go down the other side and I'll put the number of the bow, or I'll put the year it was built, something like that. If somebody wants a name on their bow, I like to write that on the outside of the upper limb and put it in parentheses. It's just kind of a nice little touch, and it personalizes the bow.
You can see here's one that's done in ink against the blonde wood. It shows up real nice.
Yeah, that's a real nice job. Now, once you get that lettered, I go ahead and I'll wool down that lettering, and then I'll do a couple more coats of finish. And then I'll let the thing dry for probably about 2 or 3 days. The finish process takes basically almost as long as it takes to build the bow. If you do a nice finish, it's going to take some time, so you want to allow for that. It's the hardest thing because you're in a hurry to shoot it, you're wanting to get out and have some fun with it, and you've just got to let it hang there and look at it. But take the time to finish it right, and it'll really make you happy down the road. Once you do get the finish dry on it, you're going to have to apply some leather to the sight window. You need a strike pad on the sight window, and you're going to need a leather pad on your arrow shelf. And some people like to put leather on the handles. Mike, you got any ideas on that? Want to show us what you've done?
Yeah, there's a couple different things that you can do. Can you go ahead and clear those off? I'm
Sure,
going to grab a
bet.
couple bows here. Now on this part of the bow, again, it's purely preference. You may want to put leather on your handle for aesthetics. On the bow that we glued up, we actually used two-part core material. So we actually had a seam in the middle, and so to cover that seam, we wanted to wrap that with leather. If you're using one-piece laminations, you actually don't have a seam, and it makes a real nice bow just to have the natural wood there. See the beauty of the natural wood. You can see on this bow here, we've put leather on the in the sight window, and we've got leather also on the arrow shelf. And that's all this one has. This one here is actually wrapped with tennis racket grip. You can get that at your pro shops. I've seen people use the same wrap that they use for golf clubs. It comes in 3/4 inches wide, and it wraps right around. Now I have a little also piece of leather on in the sight window, and I actually don't use a shelf on mine. I actually have a piece of leather that sticks up that the arrow rests on. But it really gives you a chance to customize your bow. We have a couple other ones here made by other people, just to give you an example of how creative you can get. This is a bow that was made almost 20 years ago, and this handle is made out of braided Dacron fishing line. It's what we use up here to fish for halibut. They've actually got a piece of ivory on the inset to hold the arrow off of the shelf, or excuse me, to hold the arrow off of the sight window. But the handle is actually braided fishing line that's been soaked in glue. It makes a nice, comfortable handle. A lot of different things you can do. If you are using leather, you want to make sure you use a real good contact cement or a cement that's made for leather. Gives you a chance to really make the bow your own. I think we're just about ready to go out and shoot these, aren't you? Don't you think so?
I think so. Well, there you go. That's what it's all about. Throwing arrows out of a bow you built yourself. I hope we've helped you a little bit with this video. Don't stop with us. Do a lot more research, practice. There's some good books out there to read. There's some other videos to look at. Refine your skills, and pretty soon you'll be building a bow that you're proud to shoot and show your friends.
Building your bow should be a labor of love. Take your time and enjoy what you're doing. Building it is almost as fun as shooting it.
Appreciate y'all joining us. We'll see you out on the range. And get my safety gear on, and we'll get those ground down. Or a form you can build a couple different types of bows off of.
What did I say?
A bow you can build a couple of forms off of.
Yeah, you can do that too.
And I'm going to make a mark at 3/4. As you can see, we've already covered all the fiberglass with a plastic. Hold it just a minute, Phil. Got a big sliver.
Hope to see you out on the range sometime.
Let's do it again. That sucked worse than